Oh man. All right. Well, since we have Chris as a guest, it would be sweet to talk about some AI
Did
stuff.
you guys want to do introductions?
Yeah, let's get intro.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I guess you
Guest number one,
could tell
Chris.
us a little bit about your background if you want. We haven't talked about our backgrounds yet, but
We should probably do that too.
yeah.
Well, I'm from Alabama originally. Grew up, lived there for 20 some odd years. Let's see. Before I went to college, I was big into fencing in high school.
Nice.
I was ranked 250th in the world, 50th in the country in my division, and
Shit,
champion of the southeastern United States. Let's see. In college, I studied finance primarily. My major was finance. I had a minor in psychology. All my electives were in economics. After school, I worked in the finance side of things, I worked as a financial advisor, controller, financial analyst. But I've done a lot of random little jobs, usually somewhere in between business and tech. I have worked for the public sector some too, I've done some contracting for local governments and stuff. So I've kind of hit just about any kind of angle you can see about a company, small to large or whatever. But usually, like I said, I'm sort of focused on through my career, I focus more on the business to technology. Even as a financial analyst, I was working more to develop macros and stuff related to making Excel better for the finance people than I was.
Gotcha.
Lately, though, I've also done about 5 years of independent study since I graduated college. It's been broken up. That's where I've gotten most of my technical expertise. Places like Coursera, where you can take tons of free online classes from the best colleges. I have a data science certificate from Johns Hopkins, where they have a really cool 10-course program on data science that you can do through Coursera. And a bunch of other certificates through that. Lately in the past couple years, 2.5, I've been really focused on AI safety since Elon Musk started trying to raise the warning, and then a lot of other people like Stephen Hawking and Sam Harris.
A lot of alarm bells.
John Tillian, of course, Ray Kurzweil's been talking about this for a long time, has some of the most, documented, the Singularity documentary and stuff, where his views are typically more optimistic. There's a wide range there, but I've been trying to get a broader picture of AI safety because it's not even just the idea of the safety of this particular AI program, but the economic impact of AI safety. What are we going to do when cars are automated?
Yeah, how's it going to impact society as a whole?
Right. And then in the long run, even if we get AI right from the design safety standpoint, how do we also deal with the political and economic ramifications of having no need to work and stuff?
I mean, this is going to be the second industrial revolution, essentially, in terms of how radical it is in changing relations.
And even probably more monumental than the industrial
Revolution.
revolution. So,
Yeah. So that's a lot.
Yeah, it's slightly terrifying, but I get it.
So what worries you most about AI? Oh, well, actually, you know what? We should probably do introductions about stuff.
You guys.
Sorry.
Okay.
All right, so excited to get into it. But anyway, so I'm Dan. I'm still going to school currently, but my major is in history and education, and I want to be a history professor. I'm about to get my BA and go on for my master's, so still chugging along. What about you, Drew?
I'm Drew, and I just got my degree in psychology. Trying to figure out whether I want to go on the clinical side of things or more on the research side of things. I've done a lot of just free research and philosophy, and I've done a lot of undergrads classes in biochemistry and chemistry, more of the harder sciences, but have really gotten into more soft sciences as it's gone on, just because of the human application to it.
I think you both should talk about where you're from too.
Okay, that's fair. That was pretty brief. It's you go to school and introduce
intro is
yourselves.
5 minutes.
Okay, let's see. So me and Drew and Sean is currently not here. We all grew up in the same town, which is this little remote mining town, or old historic mining town in Northern California called Nevada City. And I grew up in a little log cabin in the middle of nowhere. My dad was the local police sergeant at a department that had 8 people, so it was a really small town. Let's see. We all moved up here to Oregon, which has been awesome. And I originally wanted to be a police officer like my dad. But that was kind of before I had done a lot of serious introspection and learning about the world and stuff. And I had kind of my existential questioning period where I decided I was doing that more just kind of following in his footsteps than what was actually what I wanted to do. And I took a year off of work, which was very fortunate that I was able to do that. I know a lot of people don't get the opportunity. But I just kind of, followed my interests wherever they took me. And I had always loved history, but I didn't really take it seriously because I thought it was just kind of a hobby. But I found with all my free time, it was just nothing but history. These guys know I'm always talking about that shit. I started with ancient Greece. I would always relate everything to something about Athens and Sparta, or the political dynamics in the city-states and all kinds of different things. And then from there it really spread. I got interested in Rome, and then especially once I became more involved in politics during 2016, I got way more interested in more contemporary stuff. So like the Great Depression and the New Deal and the Enlightenment, and kind of like the emergence of capitalism out of feudalism and that whole process. So my interests have really diverged in a lot of ways, but it all feels interconnected, starting from a grounding in ancient history, and I don't know, I love it. I eat it up. That's my favorite thing. So now I'm going to be a professor eventually. I definitely want to teach history, and yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah, like Dan said, we're from like Grass Valley, Nevada City area, and I think like one of the biggest difference between like Sean and Dan and I maybe would be like our upbringing. So like Sean, he's not, like Dan said, he's not here, but he grew up with like a bunch of siblings, like 7, and his dad was like a pretty wealthy guy. They lived up in like
a mansion, essentially.
Yeah.
It used to be like an old
bed and breakfast.
Bed and breakfast, yeah.
But both Dan and Sean were like living up in kind of like the mountainous area of like the town, whereas I was like pretty central in the town. And all of my family, like my dad, my stepdad, and my mom are all in the court system. So my dad was has been a lawyer forever. My mom was she just retired, but was in being a secretary for a judge and various other like people within the court system for 30 years. And then my stepdad's now a commissioner. So I definitely had that like law influence, I guess, that more like a little bit more structured influence in that way. Whereas I think it feels like Dan's dad was a police officer, but he was like a pretty awesome police officer who didn't follow everything by the book, I guess, is like the best way to put it.
Well, in a good way. That cuts both ways.
Oh,
he was the good one.
Yeah. And Sean's dad, he ran his own business, so like since he was a kid, like put everything into it and lived in his like his first building for his business, so just until he could get enough money to like buy a house outside of it. So yeah, I think that like most of my interests for a very long time were centered in more like in the harder sciences. But as I got into college, I saw that like there was, I guess one of the biggest things that got me into like all of philosophy was I had an idea of like really wanting to help create a house that was like self-sustaining. And as I was like in researching that kind of stuff, I found that it's not because the technology's not there, but it's because the demand for it isn't there, which kind of got me into the reason why, like, okay, well, why is that a thing? And then you get into like all of the different, because to me it was so obvious that we needed it. If you think like ecologically,
just objectively, we do need it.
Right. And like it would be like, to me, I was like, this should be something that we're all like looking for, since it is something that we all have, like we all live in a home, and if we can make that like give us as much of like the energy and resources that we need to live, why not do that? And so, but going from that, I like kind of got plunged into just different ways people like look at the world, why everyone isn't ecologically minded, because there's like plenty of different like religions or worldviews that people like will ground themselves in. And so that I just got really interested in that for a while, and that got me really into like people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and stuff like that. So listened a lot to their stuff, which really got me into psychology, and that's ultimately like where I decided to get my degree, just because I find it so fascinating that there's like a lot of development, research and development that has gone on, but for some reason there seems to be a disconnect between being able to actually like implement everything that we've developed in a way that seems to be like everyone agrees is a good idea.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
So, yeah, so that's I guess why I got planted into the psychology aspect of things. But I'm very much interested in like ecological thinking and like the cool developments in science and stuff like that, and how to apply that and help people, you know, like to live better lives too in the philosophical realm.
Nice. All right, I guess it's my turn. So I grew up in Medford, and my dad was a chemistry teacher at the time, but in his past he got a degree in biology, worked for the Forest Service for a little while, managed a gun club, shot competitively, apprenticed himself out as a machinist, and was a gunsmith for a few years. So definitely a jack of all trades in a lot of practical ways, at least. And my mother was a social worker working for the VA, so I got a good healthy dose of like psychology and social work from her when I started talking to her more in high school. We didn't necessarily talk about those things before that, but I talked to her a lot about that during my high school years. And then I got a pretty good informal science education from my dad just from talking to him about a lot of things. Also, I've been shooting since I was like 7, so that's a huge part of my life, and also just like building things, and so like hands-on stuff. So when I went to college, I did mechanical engineering and pre-med. The idea of going to medical school at some time probably, but mechanical engineering is more like a fallback career. And after graduating now, I'm kind of thinking that I want to get into robotics, so I'm thinking about going to get a master's in robotics now. And my interests as of late have been a lot into programming. I've been learning a lot about Python in the recent past, and I've been enjoying that a lot. I like the critical thinking that affords me. And I also have been studying a lot of history through, mostly through Dan Carlin and a few other podcasts.
Oh, yeah.
And my most studied era right now has been World War I and World War II, but also a little bit into the Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and then some into like the Roman Empire and a few other little specific parts of history, but I haven't studied nearly as much as Dan to be more exhaustive about. And not that anyone can actually be exhaustive about it anymore, but
no. The more you learn, the more you're just like, I don't know shit. It's so much.
Yeah, unfortunately, the more I learn about World War II, the more confused I get about different parts of it. It seems,
yeah.
You know, I'm just like, wait, there was an African front? Fuck. And then like, oh shit, now I gotta learn about Japanese imperialism if I want to understand the Pacific front. And so, but anyway, so yeah, as far as like informal study, those are probably where I've spent most of my interests the past couple months at least, or maybe the past year, I would say. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from, I guess. So I think that's probably a good enough introduction.
Yeah, I think that's solid.
Other things could be gleaned later on.
Yeah, I mean, that's barely tip of the iceberg there.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So now I think we can go ahead and go into AI safety. And
all right.
I heard that you had a question. Already.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a good place to start is just like, what worries you the most as someone who definitely spends a lot of time researching this stuff?
Yeah, so it's there's an interesting thing with the worry aspect, right? Because it's like there's the percentage of likelihood that this event's going to impact us,
right?
And there's the actual devastation the event could cause, right?
Yeah.
There's a high percentage chance that self-driving cars, right, extremely high, is going to be an impact we're going to have to deal with. But compared to some of the other issues in AI safety, it has a lower devastation. So
we're talking about job loss, essentially.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
The disruption of the economy.
Yeah.
But when we look at like the actual like AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, meaning a human level or greater intelligence, right? The threat that could eliminate the entire human population, which is called an existential threat, right? If you guys ever look into that kind of stuff.
Definitely.
So, you know, stuff that's monitored by like the Future of Humanity Institute and the Future of Life Institute and stuff like that, the Center for Existential Risk and places. But yeah, AI safety, that's the first part we usually look at, because like obviously any existential risk, even if it's 0.0001%,
You should
you
worth
know,
looking at.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
the end of everything, right? So it's
Yeah.
the worst possible
Take
thing.
that seriously.
Yeah. So, and the problem is too, we really can't put a percentage on what the chance is that we can
Because there's so
develop
many
a safe.
unknowns.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really just a big question mark as to even the timeline to develop it, much less the timeline to develop it
Yeah.
safely. So that's I would say the biggest fundamental concern I have. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll have the biggest negative impact. Obviously, like the disruption to the economy is just going to be so massive, and like we are 100% going to have to, like if we don't get destroyed, we 100% have to deal with this economic disruption. And a lot of the people in AI safety right now are typically more focused on the technical aspect,
Right.
and that's why we don't really have a lot of this conversation bubbling up yet. I mean, even with like self-driving cars, it's kind of starting to get there, but there's still like this pushback where people are like, nah, it's still far away. We don't have to worry about this.
It's gonna come pretty soon.
Oh yeah,
It's not that
I
far
mean,
off.
We're in a few years from having. I mean, there's cars already that are better drivers than humans.
Yeah.
It's just the getting it deployed and getting the legal aspects of it taken care of first, right?
I think it's interesting the way the way you're framing it now is nice, because even if we don't get an AGI, we're still going to have to deal with the impacts of AI
Exactly.
as that keeps
As they
becoming
unroll.
better and better.
Yeah.
And so like even if we don't have a flip the switch and the entire labor market is fucked moment, we're going to have little versions of that as we keep going regardless.
Exactly.
Which, if anything, I think that could actually be worse for political instability. I mean, the political situation is pretty sketchy right now as it is. I mean, there's a lot of uptick in discontent. So
Yeah,
if you're just adding boom, 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 shit's gonna start moving.
Yeah, and I really like the way that Sam Harris was putting it in his TED Talk about AI safety, where he was talking about like if we assume any amount of technological improvement at all, then we will eventually get to an AGI. And
for
so
sure.
if that's essentially an eventuality, unless our race gets destroyed somehow, then it doesn't make any sense to put our heads in the sand and be like, well, we'll deal with it later, because it's going to happen. So
And we're getting closer. So I mean, that should be like at the forefront of discussion is what does an AGI world look like?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
that's where we're going.
Right.
It's so weird that that's happening almost on a parallel timetable to kind of like the more dangerous impacts of climate change unfolding. Like that's going to be over the next century.
Right.
AI is going to be over the next century. And both these things are things where we're just kind of putting it in the future where we don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And yeah.
totally.
And then when you think about the pairing of those two different things impacting society, it's going to be an interesting era.
Like you were mentioning the economic and political instability, and like how potentially having the more stilted development can
Yeah.
make it worse, because I mean the big concern is the way that like wealth's distributed, because AI just makes it so easy for a single person to just generate massive amounts of wealth,
And they don't
never
even
need to
need
employ
workers.
anyone.
Yeah.
So like that's the problem, is that like do people just start snatching up one industry at a time, and we get more and more billionaires and trillionaires, and really at that point the trillionaires or billionaires can just hire all the AI experts, right?
Yeah.
And then get them to keep building them stuff. So it's
dangerous.
I think the difficulty also lies both in like the climate change and as well as the AI is like, I think a lot of people don't feel like they have nearly enough information or effect on either of those matters to even like talk about them. So like I get that like Sam would like everyone to be discussing those kind of things, but it's like I think the way that our society is structured right now seems to be that people will focus more on like what they have to do in order to like take care of their families or take care of like the day-to-day kind of stuff.
Right.
And they're hoping that there will be some underlying structure that will like allow them to take care of the earth, or like be able to talk about like AI. I don't even know if that's even on the radar for most people.
Right,
You know what I mean? Like they don't even like they're just like, well, the richest people will just be able to do anything at that point, which they kind of already do effectively in my life.
right.
Well, we don't really have any institutional method to really educate and discuss these things anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, the corporate media is essentially just geared towards viewership and entertainment and sensationalism.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not talking about any serious issues, whether it's climate change or inequality or AI. I mean, it's just a circus, and
Totally.
people aren't being educated. And I mean, the economic situation, is pretty tenuous already. People are having to work as hard as they can just to get by. And
Exactly.
they don't have time to deep dive into, heavy intellectual issues about the future.
Right. Or spend like a whole weekend going to some sort of rally or something
Yeah.
like that.
And I mean, we have a political climate where, most politicians are, like the media, wholly owned subsidiaries of different moneyed interests. So it's not like, you have some politicians starting to discuss these things, but we don't have like a vibrant political culture of discourse.
Well, isn't there difficulty in just like the most natural intuition coming from AI just being that it's like, I have no idea anything about AI unless I have any computer science background whatsoever. And then how am I supposed to control that whatsoever? Okay, so if I don't have control over it, who does? Smart rich people. And then you're just like, okay, and then what does AI do? Fix any problem? That's probably how most people think about it. Okay, well, they're going to be able to make the world however they're going to want to do it. So it seems like such an intuition that leaves people in the there's literally nothing I can do about it,
Yeah, and I think that intuition holds true with the climate science too, where people, in large part don't understand climate science from a ground up perspective, which is understandable because it's extremely complex. But then you have to essentially take it on faith from people that you trust, quote unquote, that's a real thing.
Right.
So somewhere along the lines, you have to have trust in scientists and the scientific method and the scientific community as a whole, or in AI experts, and then you have to listen to what they think you should do.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of faith on one hand, and it's a lot of just I don't know, it's not like hand waving because it is more just the faith aspect that those people know what they're talking about. But then I feel like most people are like, well, I don't understand this and it's very otherworldly to me, so I'm gonna assume that the people at the powers that be have got it. And that's, I feel like a lot.
Well,
of
and it's not even happening in a neutral environment. I mean, it'd be
Exactly.
one thing if you
That's
had that information present, and it's like, okay, are people going to be able to learn about this stuff and do
Right.
something about it? But I mean, you have political and economic interests spending huge amounts of money to actively discourage people to come to conclusions that will disrupt those profits. I mean, we know oil companies knew about climate change 50, 60 years ago, and immediately began propaganda efforts to try and get people to not realize it or to do anything about it.
And that actually could be more insidious than people think too, by sowing seeds of doubt in the scientific community.
Yeah, they have. That's a whole political movement now.
Yeah, and the fact that it's happened. For people that are scientifically inclined, when they look at articles or they look at any kind of research that has been done that denies climate science, there's holes that you can poke in it endlessly. Yeah. And all of the renowned scientists do that. But from a layman perspective, it could seem more like there's not a consensus.
Yeah.
And there's very loud voices from three people that are like, climate change isn't real, and then other people are like, no, you're retarded. And then from a layman perspective, you might see that as oh, nobody knows, it's not an agreement. And so I think that type of propaganda, it's hard to understand, for me at least, how much of an effect that could have.
I think it's pretty pervasive.
I feel like it could be too.
Certainly in the United States. I mean, apparently climate denial is way worse here than most countries.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
Because the right wing, religious right in particular,
Yes.
has driven the narrative against that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things with AI safety too is that unfortunately the narrative of AI safety isn't even at the public level yet, because most people don't even believe that AGI is possible, right? So in the computer science community, everybody, that knows computer science knows AGI is possible. So, then there's a debate there between AI safety. Some of them essentially say we got this, don't worry. And then the other ones are like, nobody could possibly have this. What are you talking about? So, but when we get to the actual public level, we're still at the point, the conversation's really still at the point of, is this even possible? I mean, would Jesus even let us do that?
See, there's a big religious part of that too. The idea that we could create something as sophisticated as humans are kind of smacks in the face of this whole, the divinity of man and all that. So, I had an experience like that talking to my grandfather-in-law, he's a really smart guy, but he's like an old Jewish guy. And when I talked about AI, he was like, no, we can't make anything as smart as humans.
Right.
God made us. We can't be that way. And I was like, okay, man, like, if you say so.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. If we look at a lot of religions, they have a history of ignoring facts until they literally can't anymore.
Yeah.
And, it seems like they've kept up that tradition, or at least a lot of them have.
Yeah.
This is kind of a parallel to that. I don't know if religion played a part in it, but I've been thinking about it because we're talking about, like, denial of science. Chris and I watched a Philip DeFranco video yesterday about where he mentioned that North Carolina had, I think it was North Carolina that had those projections of the sea level rise and ignored it. So the scientists came out, I want to say, I don't remember the exact day, but they came out several years ago, and I'll look it up in a moment, and they said that the sea level was going to rise 39 inches in the foreseeable future, and that they needed to do things about that.
Right.
And the government, looked at it and said that it would cost billions of dollars to, essentially, make new flooding zones and, fix up roads and do whatever is needed to sort of, mitigate the problems that are going to come with that. And they basically decided that it was going to cost too much. And then they essentially said that it wasn't going to happen. They made legislation that basically said that they could not use the scientific projections, and that they were only allowed to use historical data to predict the future.
You can never use any policy based on the idea that the sea level is going to rise.
I read about that too. And it's been really troubling because, the military is doing all kinds of, tests on this shit and saying, like, hey, we're going to have to move these bases, all this different shit. And Congress is like, nope, pretend it's not real. Like,
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It really is. Just the coasts in general, every coast.
Oh, it's going to be ravaged.
Yeah.
Well,
and there's so much on the coast, too. Like, the bulk
Well, it's
of
the
our
bulk of
economy.
human civilization is on the coast.
So, just before you go in,
No.
from the Washington Post, that report came out in 2010, and it estimated a 39-inch sea level rise by 2100. And from the Philip DeFranco video, he said that it's actually risen an inch per year.
Yeah.
In the recent past, since that happened,
Well,
which
that's
is actually way faster.
That's
than
the
they
scariest
anticipated.
thing is if you keep up on climate science, every new thing that comes out is saying this is happening faster than our worst case scenarios were.
Yeah.
This isn't, and everyone's like, oh no, you're overblowing it. The science is, they're going overboard. And it's like, actually, we were way below what it's actually going to be. Yeah, so.
We wish that was right. You don't understand.
And it's funny too, because some people will. I feel like some people use that narrative to sort of discount the narrative as a whole. They're like, oh well, they said they were wrong, so do they really know anything anyway?
It's like,
and it's like, okay,
they're wrong.
Their predictions
the
were
other
very
direction.
conservative. That doesn't mean they're wrong.
they were like, we need to do something, I think, about this time. And then, it's not that we need to do anything less. We need to do it quicker.
Yeah, right.
Still change. That's, I guess the bummer part for me, too, is that economically, that seems so awesome. It's going to cost billions of dollars, sure, but it's like, okay, it's all infrastructure based. You're going to actually, improve cities, because now you can actually start funneling in, money to, reestablish, different, zoning and stuff like that. Put minds to developing our cities and developing, the land that we work on and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
there is a significant loss. Are you familiar with the broken window fallacy in economics? So basically the idea is that it's sort of how people get the whole war is good for the economy thing, right?
Uh-huh.
So the idea is
It's
that,
good for the war industry.
Right. So the idea is you have a baker's shop, right?
Yeah.
Some kid throws a rock and breaks his window.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the good thing about that is now that the window repair company gets to come have a job, right?
Yeah.
The baker pays him, $100 to
Totally.
fix the window. The problem with that is that if the kid hadn't broken the window, the guy might have went and bought a suit for $100 and
Right.
tailor a job that's actually
True.
creating something without
But
destroying.
that's also, I think, important to look at what it is that we are currently spending our money on. So and being able to
I agree, we
actually
should increase
evaluate.
infrastructure a lot.
Exactly.
Well, it's also, are we spending money that we actually have, or is this going to be deficit spending in order to spur, investment in production? Because,
Right.
the New Deal, we essentially just whipped money out of thin air and said, okay, we're going to invest all this shit in the country and just kind of have faith that it's going to spur enough development that it'll pay itself out in the long run.
Yeah.
And so, there's that whole concept too. Because, with just a baker, it's he has money and money that he's spending on this, he could have spent on something else. But I mean, if it's like this big government initiative, we can just essentially.
And it's not. It's like there's gonna be
But
a
that
fucking.
does cause inflation, though. When you're
Yes.
spending money, there's ramifications to it.
And before you get into that, I wanted to say also that for instance, the Hurricane Florence that's going to hit North Carolina, it was downgraded to a Cat 2 now, but they're still expecting flooding in North Carolina of like upwards of 8 to 9 feet, I believe.
Jesus.
And so the estimated cost before they got downgraded was something like, I want to say $170 billion for rebuilding all the homes that were going to get destroyed. So, like, yes, obviously that's hindsight's 2020, but it's one of those things where we have all these predictions that there's going to be a huge amount of destruction, and we can do some, preemptive spending that, will probably hurt in the short term, but like, if we don't, what are the consequences? And in this case, it is almost like the broken window fallacy, where it's like, okay, a bunch of homes are going to get destroyed, and then the home industry is going to go berserk for a little while, but is it worth the destruction? And then one other thing, I don't want to ramble too much about this, but one other thing that I think is interesting is thinking about this from an economic perspective is interesting and it's important, but I also like to think of it from sort of like a world resource perspective. And it's like all that destruction is something that we can't really get back ostensibly, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of resources that essentially just won't get recouped, and there's going to be an immense amount of energy that goes into building homes that will just be could have done for other things.
That's another huge thing we got to talk about. Is, I mean, our whole global civilization is built on the premise of infinite growth.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, that's an even deeper root to the problem.
I mean, the fact that somehow our economic system is divorced from the idea that we are in a biosphere with limited resources, it's like, that's like, I can't even.
An economy based on the idea of sustainability would be radically different than anything we're familiar with.
Well, it's just even, I mean, I guess again, we're getting into like the more like science aspect of it, but it's like, for anyone to deny that we do have limited resources, I think like scientifically it's just like, I don't know if anyone could even say that that's like really okay, I think.
I like the way Elon Musk framed it a little bit, because he was talking about relative to like the electrical industry and stuff, and how people that are using fossil fuels are essentially being subsidized. Because people are always angry that electrical cars and stuff get subsidized, but when you're pulling limited resources out of the ground and using up the CO2,
subsidized in terms of the cost to the future.
Exactly.
Were you watching that Joe Rogan interview he did? That was so good.
It was really good.
Yeah.
The one thing that I did want to say about like how I don't think that this is like the broken window fallacy is it's not that there is a kid who's gonna run and break open the door. It's literally like there is a hailstorm that comes every few years, and we're saying it's gonna happen again, and then we're just not going to do anything about it. We're going to pretend like the hailstorm isn't
that's
coming.
what happened here. That's why, we want to do the infrastructure first so that it prevents the damage. We don't want to have to rebuild. We want to like stop it from occurring.
So it's not like, I just think it's interesting that like the kid isn't going to do it or not do it. It's like we're pretty sure it's going to happen. It's just when it's going to happen.
I think you guys agree on this for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a strong silver lining. There could be a lot of jobs made if we did like a big jobs program to change over the infrastructure, and really just kind of modernize the country. I mean, it's a huge opportunity, even though there's going to be massive costs. And I mean, quite frankly, if we're thinking in terms of like the risk of inflation, I mean, better to do it now while we still have the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, which is the biggest defense against that of any country. I mean, there's a lot of countries working to make us lose that, so we're going to be in a way worse position in the future, so we might as well do it now.
Yeah. I just think that one of the coolest things that we probably could do as like a nation is accept that there is like this kind of like the ecosystem-based biosphere thing that's occurring, like at least a system that's happening that we have to work within. Because that, I think, in and of itself, like if we can agree on that, and I don't even know if that's like a religious thing at all,
I think
like
there's a spiritual aspect to it.
I think it can come from that. I think it's very much scientifically like
we should
based.
certainly seek spirituality as an ally. In that fight. Because the oldest spiritualities universally across human history all had some kind of environmental sacredness that they grounded themselves in, and their idea as part of the ecosystem and the necessity of sustainability and stuff like that.
Totally.
And the only reason why I would like why it comes to me in that kind of way, like why I even brought up the religion thing, is because it seems to be future predicting, and it seems to be that right now people, for some, like the scientific community, they're like, yeah, it's gonna happen, right? But then there's so many people who are not in the scientific community.
We need to
say,
move it on the cultural
I don't
level.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I like to, it is cultural, I think, that we need to be able to, like, as a country, say that it's occurring. Because
Well,
we're
there's
the
some
only one who
movements-
didn't sign.
I know.
Only
we pulled
country.
out of it. We pulled out.